Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan selamat sejahtera kepada semua penonton dan pendengar yang budiman. A warm welcome and thank you for tuning in to Hard and Honest Talk series. My name is Abdul Karim Alias, the host and moderator for the intellectual discourse tonight. For your information, the Hard and Honest Talk series is a public program that focuses on intellectual discourse about current hot topics of public interest, such as education, health, security, the economy, and social issues. This program is streamed live on both YouTube, on my YouTube channel, and also on Facebook at the same time. Please feel free to share the link to your friends, to your colleagues, and please also don't forget also to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Click the notification bell so that you can get notification for the future videos and future program. So tonight, the title of our discussion is very timely, it's very interesting. So we are going to talk about Russia-Ukraine war, impact on geopolitical and economic stability. Well, ladies and gentlemen, maybe we have never thought that the war could happen between Russia and Ukraine because we are still recovering from pandemic. So the Russia's so-called military aggression against Ukraine, which has become now Europe's largest ground war in generations, has impacted millions of people and triggered a humanitarian crisis as vulnerable Ukrainians now take shelter or flee their homes. The intensification and spread of the war is deeply troubling and is having a devastating impact not only on Ukraine people, but potentially other people around the world. The lingering impact of COVID-19 has yet receded, and now we have the war. And this adds another dimension of uncertainty to disrupt the resuscitation and recovery of global economy. So, ladies and gentlemen, to discuss this and deliberate on this topic tonight, I'm joined by two distinguished educators that collectively have years of experience in foreign policy, international studies, and international politics. They will be sharing their perspectives on the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, focusing on the complex power play taking place behind the scenes and the war's impact on geopolitical and global economic stability. Well, if we still have tomorrow, if the world is not yet doomed, the question is, will we see a new pecking order after the war? Hopefully the war can end very soon. So, the question is, I think tonight maybe our panel can share their insight, whether we will see a new pecking order or maybe a complete disorder. So, let me welcome Professor Emeritus Johan Saravanamuttu and Associate Professor Dr. Azeem Fazwan Ahmad Farouk. Welcome, Prof. Both of the Prof. Azeem and also Prof. Johan. Thank you very much thank you very much for accepting my invitation. I'm very honored to have both of you in this program.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you. Yeah, I'm actually very, very honored because both of you are very well known, very eminent in your area. And this is actually my first attempt, for your information, talking about subject matter outside my immediate interest. Probably Prof. Azeem, especially, maybe you know very well that I've been talking about teaching and learning, education in general, and this is basically outside my comfort zone. But this is something that I like to do because I want to bring to the audience topics of current interest so that we can learn what's happening around the world globally and how that would impact on us. Before we start, let me briefly introduce our panel, starting from Professor Johan. So Professor Johan Saravanamuttu, he's a Professor Emeritus of University Sains Malaysia, Adjunct Professor at Asia Europe Institute, University of Malaya, and Adjunct Senior Fellow, RSIS, Nanyang Technological University. He was visiting Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Singapore, from 2017 to 2014. And he has published extensively on Malaysia, its foreign policy, the middle class, general election, the new economic policy, and political Islam. You can find more details about Prof. Johan, his biodata, on YouTube. You can find in the description below the video, and the same for Prof. Azeem as well. Let me briefly introduce Prof. Azeem. So Dr. Azeem Fazwan Ahmad Farouk obtained his BA in political science from the Paul University in 1998 and completed his MA and PhD in political science at the University of Malaya. He is an associate professor and director at the Center for Policy Research and International Studies, CenPRIS, University Science Malaysia. And he was a visiting scholar at the Institute of ASEAN and African Studies, Humboldt University Berlin, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Northern Illinois University, and the Department of Social Sciences, the University of Freiburg, Switzerland. So we are very privileged to have the two eminent speakers who have wealth of experience in the area of foreign policy and international studies. So let us start the ball rolling now. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the war, probably we have never seen it coming because we are still grappling with the pandemic and the economy is still in the early stage of recovery. But I think many people, including myself, probably we don't really understand the history and how this war came about. So maybe we can start off our discussion tonight, try to understand the background of the Russia-Ukraine conflict or Russian-Ukraine war. Now it's no longer a conflict. So maybe Prof. Johan, you can start the ball rolling by sharing with us the general background, and maybe also if you can share with us whether this war can be considered as a proxy war, and what do you think in the end President Putin's wanted to achieve ultimately? So over to you, Prof. Johan.
Okay. Well, very good evening, gentlemen, and thank you very much, Prof. Karim, for inviting me to share my thoughts.
Thank you.
And Azeem, long time no see. It's good to see you. Catch up. Let's say that this Ukraine war is part and parcel of a international, or rather, it's embedded in an international system, which simply allows for wars. I mean, we are in an anarchic international system. While there may be something called international law is not enforceable, right? Compared to what we in international relations call municipal law, which is applied at the national level. So if you're within a country, within a state, the laws count, the laws work, the laws are enforced. But internationally, there are no such laws that can restrain countries from going to war. And as you know, we had wars, continuously, whether it was back in the old ages or after even the so-called long peace. And I want to talk a little bit about the long peace, which was brought about, I don't mind, I take a little bit of time, by the end of the Cold War. So we had World War II, and after World War II, we had a long period with Cold War. And that long peace, according to John Geddes, the Cold War historian, was brought about by a nuclear balance of power. We had two major superpowers, and now, of course, we have several others. And because they possess this enormous amount of nuclear capability and power, which could blow the world up, several times, tens of times, you as a scientist would know, we were afraid to actually use them. So it was unusable power. But it was sufficient power to keep the world, according to John Geddes, right, at peace. But my argument is that this peace is not, I've given a talk about this, the peace that John Geddes calls the long peace. We haven't had no world war yet since 1939, let's say. Right? We have had no world war, but we have several wars. But so he says there's a long peace, but you can have, in a way, wars can go on if they do not affect or they do not directly engage the superpowers or the nuclear powers. So that's the kind of background we're in. And so we've seen all kinds of wars. I mean, now in the Asian part of the world, we've seen Vietnam War, we've seen wars in the Middle East. In fact, before this Ukraine war, there were continuous wars going on in Yemen. There was a war going on, So it's not unusual to see this sort of thing happen. What is unusual for me, and maybe I'll stop there, is that this is happening in the heart of Europe, or it is happening in what is considered by most analysts and by Europeans themselves, I presume, to be a very stable part of the world. However, I would add the caveat that Europe is only stable for the EU countries. It's not necessarily stable for the non-EU countries. So at the end of the Cold War, you had this enormous expansion of NATO, which is one of the major causes of this current situation, which put Russia, which is the major superpower, the major power. I mean, we don't call it superpower in the European area, theater, you might call it, into a situation of anxiety and insecurity, and that, I think, is the sort of the backdrop why the Ukraine war started. But there are many, many other issues, but that's kind of the broad kind of spectrum or broad sort of picture that I want to sort of paint for a start.
Okay, maybe Dr. Azeem can add on to that. I think we need to understand first what's actually the motivation for Putin to invade Ukraine, whether reluctantly or he has no choice. So what's the motivation behind it? And because from what I observe and from my understanding, the US and its allies, the European countries, appear to be encouraging Ukraine to go into loggerhead, to war with Russia in the name of protecting its sovereignty, and Ukraine looks like to be playing along. So yeah, Dr. Azeem, can maybe what's the motivation of Putin here to get involved in this war?
First and foremost, I would like to thank Professor Karim for having me in this program tonight. And I haven't seen Professor Johan for quite some time. I think the last time I saw him was probably in the early 2000s before he left USF. Going back to your question, I do feel that you had actually mentioned something earlier at the very outset about proxy war. And I do, and in my mind, what is going on in Ukraine at the moment is actually a proxy war between two great powers. One is Russia, that used to be part of the Soviet Union, and NATO, that is actually headed by the United States of America. I think, despite you saying that you people don't see this war coming, I think this war has been in the long time. I mean, it has been in the making for quite some time. I think when Russia decided to invade Crimea in 2014, it is actually an early indication that all is not well in Europe. This has to do with the fact that after the Second World War, there are clear sphere of influence between the West and the Soviet Union. If you look at NATO, NATO started out as a 12-member state organization, and now it has been enlarged to 30, and it has included many former Russian satellite states like Macedonia and so on. And I think to understand what is going on in Putin's mind or in the minds of the players in Russia, we need to go back to the Second World War. This has a lot to do with how Hitler started the Second World War in Europe, and how Russia felt insecure by what was happening in Europe at that point in time, and Russia, I think, decided to invade or went to war with Finland, and that was the beginning of how Russia wanted to push the West further to the West, as opposed to allowing them to get closer to Russian borders. So I do feel that this has to be in the back of our minds in order for us to understand the insecurity that Russia faces at the moment. Russia is actually a great power that is in decline at the moment. Whereas, you see NATO, despite the fact that Warsaw Pact is no longer in existence, is gaining more strength. So we need to understand the balance of power has tilted in favor of the West, too much in favor of the West, whereas Russia is actually on the decline. But at the same time, we can see that Russia is also a major producer of commodities, and the West, especially Europe, is actually hungry for power, oil and gas from Russia. So how do you balance out this situation? And I think in Putin's mind, Ukraine has to be neutralized in one way or another. It has to be a buffer state between the West and Russia. So that is what is happening at the moment. Whether or not it will escalate further, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO, even though the West wants Ukraine to be part of NATO. But if this war if this war is to escalate, because in NATO, a war against one state is actually a war against all. So this will actually create a situation similar to the Second World War. We don't want this to happen. But I think if we listen to the narrative that has been brought about by the Western media, it seems they seem to be having this narrative that Putin is the root of all evil, whereas the West is absolved of any responsibility at all. But we know for a fact that the West, especially the United States, has been arming Ukraine. They have not done anything to de-escalate the situation, whereas they are actually promoting the so-called proxy war. And I think we need to understand that what Putin is doing is something along the line of preemptive self-defense. I'm not advocating preemptive self-defense, because if you look at what the major powers have been doing, especially the United States, they have been engaging in this preemptive self-defense for many, many years. And they have been destroying humanity when that happened. So the war against terror, for example, is a preemptive defense by the West. And the West is also equally responsible for what happened in Kosovo. So I think, we need to look at this situation in Europe holistically. And of course, Europe has been the source of instability in the world since World War One. And then we have the Second World War. And as Professor Johan has said, many proxy wars in between. And even after the fall of the Soviet Union, we see that the world is not, there is no stability at the international level. So I'll stop there for the time being.
All right. Before Prof. Johan head on, let me summarize very briefly from my understanding. So it's about the balance of power. NATO is growing much bigger now, and the Warsaw Pact is no longer there. So there's a very significant imbalance of power, so to speak. And Russia now is felt threatened because of the expansion of NATO, and the NATO countries become closer and closer to its border, right? And they need Ukraine to be the buffer. So, to me, from my understanding, NATO is the real problem here. So, Prof. Johan, am I right to say that it seems like the war now can be avoided? From my opinion, it can be avoided in the by if NATO play their role to just stop the expansion of NATO and just saying that we don't want Ukraine to be part of NATO, and that give the assurance to Russia. Am I right, Prof. Johan?
Okay, I do agree with you and also with Azeem on the broad idea of the balance of power, as you put it. And I said, and I also prefaced the thing to say that there's nothing to stop another country from, attacking another country under the current global system, right? Anarchic world system. However, there are some norms that do exist in our so-called, some political scientists will call it the international society, right? This is the English school of international relations. So there are norms that we practice, that territorial integrity, for example, is sacrosanct, right? So if a country is already recognized as a sovereign state, maybe it goes back to the Treaty of Versailles or whatever, even, but I think even it comes closer to our modern era. The territorial integrity of a state is sacrosanct. Malaysia guards its borders very, very jealously, and it would not let anybody intrude in our borders. So the problem does start with, of course, NATO expansionism. I think both of you have pointed it out. I think, Azeem, you're spot on. Countries like Latvia, Estonia, and the other one, Lithuania, they're right at the border of Russia. So, and all of these countries were former Soviet Union countries, right? And obviously, Ukraine was a red line. So when it reached the point where Ukraine was pushing very hard for NATO membership, and apparently there was kind of agreement when Gorbachev, negotiated the end of the Cold War, that there are certain red lines that NATO is not supposed to cross, not supposed to expand so much. So when Zelensky more or less said, "I want to be part of NATO," not only do I want to be part of NATO, I want to be part of the European Union. That was a big, huge, red line for Putin. And Putin representing Russia, and there are Russian communities within Ukraine, right? There are two, Luhansk, and the other one is Donetsk. Have Russian separatist movements happening, and both are now recognized, have already been recognized prior to this, and prior, just at the point of time of I think more or less the Crimea, right? Azeem, I'm not wrong. Takeover. It was a takeover. Crimea was part of Ukraine. It was in the Obama period. Russia invaded and took over Ukraine. And then these two territories were subsequently recognized by Russia. So that principle of territorial integrity was violated. even though we might understand why this had happened, the asymmetry, the power between NATO and Russia on one hand, the Warsaw Pact is gone. One can lay the blame on the Western powers, and particularly on the United States of America, right, for pushing the envelope to the point. You push, something is bound to happen. But and if you look at, if I can share the thing with you now, this screen with you.
Go ahead. Yeah.
The majority of countries, like it or not, I share screen. Huh?
Yeah, share screen. Just click share screen.
Share. How do I do it? Click on share.
Yeah, click share, then
choose what you want to share. Okay. I'm struggling with this. Okay. Well, it doesn't matter if I can't share it. But I wanted to show you that the voting. Well, let me just read it to you. Easier for me to just read. The voting on the UN resolution. This is not the security one. The UN General Assembly voting was 141 countries out of, these are sovereign states of the world now, 193 member states voted for the resolution, with 35 abstentions and 5 voted against. Because the ones that voted against the resolution was Belarus, which is very close to Russia, as you know, North Korea, Eritrea, and Syria. And on the other side, you had countries like Singapore, which is the only country in Southeast Asia which actually sponsored the resolution. So I think you must have heard the Foreign Minister, Vivian Balakrishna, making a very big speech about how a small state like Singapore our sovereignty and territorial integrity is so important. How can we let this sort of thing happen? So there is that kind of perspective as well, right? There's that kind of perspective. So we are in that kind of bind right now. So we go by the international law, norms, etc. This is something that is not on. However, let me put on the other side, neither is NATO playing ball, right, with international rules. If you go by international rules, unilateral sanctions are not on. They are illegal in a sense. Only sanctions which are condoned or taken by the United Nations or what do you call it, approved by the United Nations are considered to be proper sanctions, right? So the US has been playing this kind of game for a very long time. Whenever it wants to to take action against a particular state, like Iran, for example, it doesn't agree with its policies, it would sort of impose all kinds of sanctions on that country. So we are in that kind of situation where yes, you can see that the action of it's an invasion, a Russian invasion in Ukraine can be justified from one point of view because of balance of power and major power politics, etc. On the other hand, if you follow some of these rules and norms of international behavior, it runs against the rules, as it were. And so we are stuck, as it were. How do we resolve these kinds of problems? Maybe, Azeem, you have some ideas.
No, it's okay, Azeem.
Right.
What I am trying to understand here, what's in it for US?
Yeah.
Why they are encouraging Ukraine,
Yes.
and also NATO at the same time, they are together. What's in it for them if Ukraine get involved, in the war with Russia? Because they can easily stop the war by saying that, okay, don't worry, we are not going to take Ukraine into NATO.
Allow Ukraine to join NATO, yes. Not interested. They didn't say that. Biden said, you're free. You're a free country. Join us if you can, if you want to.
I think as a global hegemon, the United States does not prefer Russia or any other state for that matter to take the lead in world affairs. And I think taking into account what is happening with the rise of China, and China and Russia are actually they do have a cordial relationship, and I think China, the trade between China is Russia's biggest trading partner.
Right.
The number one, for Russia, China is their biggest trading partner, and it's followed by the EU. And I think for the United States to check the rise of China, they need to create some kind of diversion, and this has to do with what is going on. Strengthening EU is actually something. Not strengthening NATO is something that can actually help the United States to maintain its position as the global hegemon, and of course. When you look at what happened in Ukrainian politics, there were two revolutions. I think number one is the Orange Revolution?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Prof. And then it followed, and it was followed by another revolution. And during this revolution, there were proxy leaders. One leader was actually supported by the West, another one by Russia, and I think both powers, both great powers, Russia and also the West. They wanted to have their man running Ukraine.
Okay.
And this, has to do with, values as well. They want to promote a leader that can identify with Western values of liberalism and also market capitalism, as
Right.
opposed to someone that is, condoning state capitalism. What we have in Russia is ultimately state capitalism. It's not really capitalism that is actually fundamentally run by market forces. So we see a balancing act being done by the global hegemon. We are actually now living in a unilateral world. We have the States, a hyper power that want to dictate the norms and values of international relations, and it doesn't, and a global hegemon like the United States would not take kindly challenges that would come from maybe Russia or even China for that matter. And I do feel that the US would want to control or push the Western sphere of influence further east. And this is what is going on, and they wouldn't want to send their ground troops to Ukraine. That would be another an overextension of American resources. But they would want Ukraine to be in the forefront of this battle, and we have seen this happen many times in global affairs. For example, immediately after the Second World War, there was the Korean War. It is also a kind of a proxy war between the Soviet Union and the United States. With the Vietnam War, for example, the US would actually encourage one state to start something and continue with the war. Some people would argue that it has a lot to do with the military-industrial complex in the US. So there are many factors at play, but there's no doubt, as a global hegemon, the United States would want to continue as the number one superpower in the world, and it would not take kindly any challenges coming from any state, for that matter.
So the US always want to have the upper hand. They want to dominate the world. That, right? That's what they are trying to do now. They cannot allow other countries to challenge their dominance, right? I read somewhere recently, US has invaded or involved in some form of war with about 80 plus countries in the world.
Large number.
And most of those countries are through proxy war.
Yes, that's right.
Incredible. Okay, then before we move on, maybe we can address one or two questions here from Mark Zuknik here. Can the secular liberal Western ideals, which have been ascendant since 1990s, survive the geopolitical storms currently ravaging the globe. Wow.
Very, very profound question.
High order questions.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I can take a stab at it, Mark
Yeah.
Zuknik. I think while Azeem is right, because it follows from your point about the hegemon, and what again theories called hegemonic stability. These are the neo realists, and even some older Marxists talk about a hegemon is a necessity for a stable world order. In fact, not just a stable world order, a stable, and we're going to move to economics right later, stable economic world order. And so the current order, I'll answer his question as I come to the end. The current order that we have, in political economy, people will call it a neoliberal world order, right? It's a capitalist system. Its globalization has become, it's globalization has occurred, as it were. And it's founded on capitalist ideas and principles. It's not a socialist system, right? It's so the dominant economic system of the world is one which is based on neoliberalism, so market capitalism, you might call it. And so that's the kind of system that the global hegemons, or hegemons, maybe there are more than one, would want to see continue. Right, because that's the kind of economic system that will bring prosperity, etc., or at least growth or wealth to these Western liberal states, and that hegemonic stability is now somewhat being challenged, or even I might even say greatly being challenged by the rise of China. I mean, how often have we heard this, right? That China is now the second largest world, economy in the world, and by 2030, there are some people predict that it will probably overtake the US. So there is a challenge on that from China. China, by the way, is playing ball with this neoliberal system as of now, but it is an interesting country. It's an interesting. I don't know whether you want to even call it a country. It's a massive, state. Some people call it a party state. It's one country, two systems, right? So it practices its economic system is in a sense a capitalist system, but its internal system is a socialist kind of system. So that is a challenge to the current hegemonic stability that is supposedly has been provided by the US. By all of these things that the US does, its control of the various parts of the regions in the world, including the Middle East, which is the major source of oil. And by the way, Russia is also a major producer of oil. So that's very important for the US to balance that as well. So that hegemony, I think, Azeem, is being challenged today.
Yeah.
And maybe this war in Ukraine is a kind of a US response to say, hello, I'm still around, and I can call the shots. I can still control this world, as it were, and it's also kind of an indirect signal to China that we do have that kind of we, meaning the United States of America and the Western world, does have that kind of clout and that kind of ability to control the international system. And so can liberal Western ideas survive? So far, as I see it, it hasn't collapsed. It's still very dominant. But the geopolitical storms that Mark is talking about is occurring. It's getting more complex. It's getting more difficult for the United States to handle, I think. And this Ukraine war, I think, is as close as we can get to even that nuclear line. So that the long peace thing that I talk about, John Gaddis, it's right there. I'm feeling a bit nervous myself. They're very close to that kind of, So can it survive this geopolitical storms? And the US not doing that too well in Indo-Pacific as well, right? Because China is really an important challenger in the Indo-Pacific region with its Belt and Road Initiative, It's got a lot of support from the African countries, now the Latin American countries. It's investing heavily in those regions and, of course, in Southeast Asia. You notice how ASEAN voted, right? ASEAN was split on the Ukraine war. Vietnam and Laos voted abstain. Singapore went all the way with the West. Understood? Huh? Malaysia is hedging all the time. In fact, I just take a couple of minutes. I had a chat with our foreign minister, Yang Berhormat Dato Saifuddin Abdullah, and he told me a few things because I was talking to him about something else. He said that Malaysia was trying to sort of decide, which way to go, but we sort of know that. We have 800 students in Russia as well. We have fairly good relations with with Russia. And when Malaysia saw that the UAE was abstaining, abstaining in the Security Council, something is happening here. So Malaysia is taking that kind of position, which is, I think, a good one. You're a non-aligned country. You don't want to be in a position where you take the stand or take, and you totally align with the West, right? You want to balance. And you want to make sure that in Southeast Asia, you don't get into a situation like Ukraine as well, right? So you have to be careful as to who you support and who you don't support, or who you hedge against in this current situation of the world.
Does it come as a surprise to you when India also abstained?
Again, no surprises, because India has had a long, very close relationship with Russia. You see? Yeah. So that has been going on, but India is hedging too. India is part of the Quad, which is set up by the US under Trump, actually, and continues with Biden, which is that association of major powers: Japan, India, US, Australia. Quad, and of course Australia is very west. It's got AUKUS as well, which is to balance China. Is entirely aimed at containing China. So the current American foreign policy is totally aimed at containing China's rise. But this is a kind of an interesting development here that gives, again, maybe it's subject to further kind of analysis, whether the US. I don't know if the US actually wants this war because Russia, because it complicates the hegemonic, hegemonic project, as it were.
I feel like US and NATO, they are playing with fire. They are making Ukraine as like a test bed, just simply to show, like US, as you said, they want to show that they still have control. They still have dominance over, the world. And I think they are really playing with fire.
It's a client state of the US, right? I mean, Ukraine is effectively a client state, but on the other side, don't forget you have Belarus, client state of the Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Union. Russia also has interest in Georgia. Two of the territories of Georgia, it's a bit like Ukraine, are recognized by Russia. Of course, the Georgian guy now wants to join Europe. So it's a very complex kind of situation.
Yeah. Okay, it's very interesting. I think maybe we can move on to talk about the sanction, because we are talking about the implication on apart from the geopolitical aspect. We are looking also on the economic, how it impacts on the economy, because it will also directly or indirectly impact on us. So I quote from on the sanction aspect. In 1919, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States described economic sanction as something more tremendous than war. The threat was an absolute isolation that brings a nation to its senses in the same way that suffocation removes all desire to fight. So the question is, my question is, why the sanction this time? The sanction is almost like immediate, and not only the sanction at the sanctioned by at the country level, but there are also private companies, like Apple, Microsoft, and so on. They also join together in the sanctions. So do you believe that the current sanction against Russia are effective, or can Russia respond or survive for some time if this sanction continue for some time?
Over to you, Azeem.
Okay.
Maybe
All right. I think we need to bear in mind that Russia is the 11th biggest economy in the world.
Yeah.
It's number 11, so its economy is huge. And of course, Russia is a major producer of oil and gas, and at the same time, Russia also produces industrial metal like aluminum, and also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, copper. And Russia and Belarus are major producers of wheat. So it is Russia is a major player insofar as commodities are concerned. And I think by having sanctions, it might hurt the Russian economy, but it will also hurt the economy of Western countries, especially Europe, because Europe relies on Russia for oil and gas, and of course, in so far as technology and also trade is concerned, the West has a lot more leverage to play with, because finance. I mean, I'm referring to finance and technology. The West has a lot more leverage when they are dealing with Russia. But insofar as commodities are concerned, I think Russia might have the upper hand. And as I said, they are actually trading heavily with China. And I think the West is also considering banning Russia from using the SWIFT code for financial transaction. That will hurt Russian banks, and it will also hurt Russian businesses in the long run. But I think Putin and his men, I think they have actually calculated all this into their equation before they went to war with Ukraine, because I think they are no longer relying on the dollar for their trade. I think only about 33% of the trade between China and Russia relies on
How many
the
percent?
dollar. About 33%. It used to be 97%. The trade between China and Russia was they use dollar. Before it was 97%. Now it has been down to about 33%.
They have an exchange system now. Yeah.
The exchange system now. So I think they are beginning to insulate themselves from the dollar, from the heavy reliance on the American dollars. So how this will play out in the long run is it is actually an open question. But for now, we know that inflation will be a major concern for the West, especially for the United States of America, and we don't know how long this will continue, because the midterm elections are in November this year. So I think if high gas prices in America will not go down well with the people in the States. So Biden has to take that into account, because there is the midterm election coming up in November. So as I said, during the Cold War, there was no sanctions in terms of oil and gas, because ExxonMobil, Shell, and so on, they continue their trade with Russia. So I think business interests will probably trump everything else in the future. So if the businesses are hurt by this war, they will begin to lobby their representative, whether in the US or in the EU, to relax on the sanctions. So I think it ultimately boils down to the powerful corporations, how they want to see this war evolve. And it's not it's not up to the man on the street, because we are only consumers. We don't have the influence that major corporations do have at the global level and even at the domestic level. So I think ultimately the man on the street will be hurt in the near term, but it also opens up another can of worm, about whether or not the globalization of finances and also whether or not countries that have different ideologies can continue to trade in this globalized system will continue. Whether there will be a new trade bloc between China and Russia. They can have something on the side if they want to continue to progress. So I think there are many different occasions or different equations that will come into play. But for the near term, I think definitely inflation is a major issue because I think a barrel of oil now, the Brent price is about $120 per barrel now, the highest since 2014.
Right.
Yeah, from $30, right? About
Yeah,
$30
yeah,
now to-
Yeah.
So
Malaysia is going to benefit. Petronas will make money.
yeah, that's what I thought.
But,
Yeah.
we're looking at the other side because slightly cynically, but the ordinary man on the street, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, would be hit by inflation. It's
They will feel the heat. They will feel the
Yeah,
heat.
definitely.
But
So-
when we talk about
it's a two-edged. Sorry, I'm just following up on the
It's okay, it's okay.
Yeah, two-edged sword.
Yeah.
Sanctions. I mean, the immediate impact on Russia has been quite bad. That the ruble is half in value and so on. But as Azeem correctly points out, it's a two-edged sword. And Russia is what? Producing is it 1/4 of the OPEC oil? So Russia is going to gain too. The price of oil goes up, Russia will gain. So maybe Putin has done these calculations. He's going to lose some, but he's going to gain some, or even more.
Yeah.
Probably.
Maybe more.
Yeah, a little bit more. The sanctions regime is also something, as I already pointed out, which is ultimately, Russia has committed an aggression against international norms, but equally, the West is now committing its own, violation of international norms. You're not supposed to do these things in our so-called free world, right? It's not a free world, and you're supposed to be the champion of the free world values, right? So that's kind of the irony of it. And as you say, if Russia can have this arrangement with China, which apparently is, it makes sense for China to enter into, if not a military, mind you, it's not going to be a military kind of arrangement, because they also have their problems with each other at the border, right? But definitely economically, the two of them can be allies. That's because America has whacked China with a massive trade war.
Yes.
Since the days of Trump, and there's not much that has changed when Biden took over, right? He just basically continued with the kind of policies, maybe at slightly lower level, of venom, of venom than what you call it, Trump did. So the push for an alternative economic system is there. I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight, where you have Marxists will call it dollar imperialism. The U.S. is the U.S. dollar is the international reserve currency, and it's holding everybody in hostage because people who buy U.S. bonds and so on, to keep in their reserves and all that, have to make sure that the U.S. dollar is being used. The U.S. dollar's value is maintained because it is the international reserve currency. But if that system is being eroded and undermined by an alternative system, and China has been working out some of these alternative systems, right? Their own digital yuan and all that, but several other things. I don't know enough about the financial economics to understand all of it. But all I can say is that this development with Russia being sanctioned so heavily would push the Russians closer to China in terms of an economic relationship, and vice versa.
Yeah, I agree with Professor Johan. I think China and Russia can enter into an agreement. I think there was Putin was in China for the Winter Olympics.
Yeah.
And I think there was an agreement between Putin and China that China and Russia will enter into all areas of cooperation. I think, as Professor Johan has rightly pointed out, China has been under tremendous pressure from the United States of America, especially with the Huawei saga. And of course the US is very curious about China's capability in terms of the 5G network, and now with what is going on in Ukraine, I think China can sell their technology to Russia, the 5G technology to Russia. Nothing is stopping them from doing that.
Yeah.
And of course, and the United States is definitely wary of what the technological capability of China in terms of telecommunications, and China's ability to muster strength in other areas as well. And as Professor Johan said, I don't think there will be a military pact between China and Russia, but economically speaking, I think both countries can rely on one another. Russia has a sizable population. China is the most populous country in the world, so they have the economies of scale to their benefit. And this can propel both countries into higher level of development, but we won't be along the lines of liberal capitalism. It will be a different arrangement, with the state playing a heavy role in the economy, and of course this might be an alternative model to what is usually referred to as the Washington Consensus. So I think this is what the US is really worried about. The rise of two so-called authoritarian states, and of course it can be a model to be emulated by other nations like the African countries, and of course China is high on its idea of non-interference. Even though it is debatable, but China prides itself as a country that does not meddle into the affairs of other states. But what China is doing in Africa and Sri Lanka, is a different question altogether. But on the surface, on the surface, go ahead, Professor Johan, go ahead.
No, I mean, you're right. I think it's interesting because we are in maybe it's going to become a tripolar world, right? We're talking about bipolar world. People now say it's multipolar, and with China clearly playing a very significant international role. And as you say, you mentioned Sri Lanka, that's the land of my father, by the way. China played a significant role in helping to bring down the Tamil, insurgency there, right? Helping that regime. So China has its own client states. Don't forget, there's also Myanmar. There's this whole pipeline, gas pipeline, right across from the, one end of Burma, and I can't remember the part, all the way to Kunming, right? So the Burma generals, of course, immediately supported Russia. They supported the Russian invasion, although the UN delegation, which is actually the Aung San Suu Kyi representative, voted against. Voted for the resolution. So we have a divided Burma now, playing proxy, proxy to two parties. So all of these new, all these geopolitical kinds of strategies and stratagems and dynamics are going on now, and I think they all point in the direction of what I already said, the increasing. Some people say the US is on the decline, actually. A declining hegemonic presence of the United States of America. I think so.
Okay, so I think the way the sanction is playing out now, I'm sure China and maybe even India, they are watching how the US and their allies use the economic sanction and the dollar to inflict maximum pain on Russia. So, do you think that by doing this, using the dollar, using the financial system like the SWIFT and so on, it will backfire on the dollar, meaning that a few years down the road, China, Russia, and maybe India, they will try to figure out how to get away or find an alternative system to diminish the power of dollar, the control of dollar on the economic system. So
I think
the
yeah.
backlash kind of.
Right, backlash. I think you
Mm.
sent us a question about the weaponization of the dollar, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, it could actually create backlash. I think basically, Prof. Azeem was talking about that. It's already creating that kind of an alternative.
Mm.
It will increasingly force countries into to look for alternatives. And what about trade pacts, right?
Yeah.
Increasingly, you see that if you look at the Indo-Pacific region, Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Pact. No big deal because there's now RCEP. RCEP has China involved in it. The TPP didn't have China, so now China is involved in the other one, and it's going to be probably the largest trade pact. India is still hedging; he doesn't want to join yet, right? Biggest trade pact in this region, the Indo-Pacific region, or the Asia-Pacific region. So, see, all these kinds of alternatives are occurring as a result of. I would. You probably put it. Maybe it's not weaponization of economic policies or using the dollar. Certainly, the kind of the hardline policies of economic control plus sanctions are forcing countries to find alternatives to the neoliberal system that is favoring I think the Western powers.
Perhaps,
there's also in our part of the world, we're also very concerned about all this anti palm oil lobby, right? In Europe and so on. So we also be looking for alternative markets, and of course, that one is called the weaponization of environmental policy. Some people like it because it's supposed to save the environment, but you're causing a lot of harm to countries who actually produce these products, right? Like palm oil.
I can see the alternative to the dollar is cryptocurrency. The cryptocurrency and the blockchain technology, because this is a decentralized system. I think that's the very reason why these people come with the idea of decentralization is to reduce or even to eliminate the dependency on the central bank. Yeah.
Central
So
banks.
that probably could be the alternative, and probably now Russia, China, and so on, probably they will be looking into that more seriously now.
China is against crypto, though. China wants to digital, so it's a bit worried about the more decentralized kind, because China wants to have control of its own financial system, or rather the Chinese, leaders. Maybe the Chinese people themselves want something else, but the Chinese leaders do want to have that control on the economy. And as you point out, it's still state capitalism, because the major groups that are participating in the economy, although they follow very basic capitalist principles, are the SOEs, right? The Chinese state-owned enterprises. They're huge. And you get a little bit too powerful or too independent, like Alibaba or Jack Ma, they can control you, right? Jack Ma has disappeared. Yeah, Alibaba has taken over somebody else.
I think weaponizing the dollar can definitely backfire, because I think we need to look at the rise of the so-called BRIC countries.
Right.
And these countries are on the rise. We have our neighbor Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, India, and if you look at in terms of market, how big the market is, it is huge. And of course, the only reason why the United States is still in the equation is due to the fact that it is a hegemon.
Hegemony.
And of course, if you look at the American economy, the United States is effectively a bankrupt country. You know, their deficits is in the trillions, and they continue to print the dollar, and it's only backed by their military prowess, nothing else. And of course, as Professor Johan has said, countries like China has bought their bonds, and of course, you know, the value lies in the fact that America is a superpower, and apart from that, I think, you know, they cannot control the dollar, and of course, I think our former Prime Minister had actually suggested that, you know, we should come up with a different currency. I think Mahathir did mention something about coming up with a different currency,
Dinar.
but it was of course shot down by the United States. And I think the idea of having an alternative currency has been floating around for many years, you know, because a lot of countries are frustrated by what the US is actually doing in terms of the world economy. And I think, you know, this is probably the beginning of, you know, an era whereby the dollar is being challenged by nothing less than probably Russia and possibly even China.
China. Interesting. I mean, it's the long-term impact of this. Yeah.
It's ridiculous how one country like US can cripple the economy of a country overnight. So I'm sure Russia and other big superpowers like China and so on now, they have been working very hard to look at the alternative system. And I personally, I want to see an alternative system because I don't like this idea of bullying, bullying the other countries through the economy, And maybe that probably we are coming to the last part of this. I think our immediate concern now is how this sanction and so on would impact our own, you know, the ASEAN economy, our region especially.
I think before we go into that, I think we need to look at something that happened in the 1960s, something similar that happened in the 1960s, especially in 1962. You know, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is something like, you know, I mean, it is a parallel of what is happening today in Ukraine. But at that point in time, the Soviet Union was trying to use Cuba as their
Base.
front, their base. And of course, you know, the world was at the brink of a nuclear war. And of course, Kennedy made the right decision not to escalate with the USSR at that point in time. And I think this is what is happening in Ukraine at the moment. You know, the Russians are feeling the Russians are actually very worried about their border integrity. And they see Ukraine as a surrogate state for the West, and they are actually reacting. And let's hope that, you know, common sense will prevail, and Russia will not attack NATO state, you know, and start a world war.
You did mention the neutralization idea. I mean, that makes the most sense, right? I mean, but of course, how do you bring that on the table, as it were? You know, if it's like the idea that it's a buffer state, as long as Ukraine is able to maintain its territorial integrity. We're back to the war part, but it is a state that is not unfriendly to Russia. And you know, the old days it was Finland, right? But it was after
Finland. That's right.
So you call Finlandization, which was a stronger term than neutralization. But if it was a country that is, you know, not going to be part of NATO, that kind of negotiation should be going on. But this current guy, Zelensky, I think is too close to the West.
That's right.
If you had Victor, the other chap who was closer, he would have probably gone for that solution. But because Zelensky is, people say more or less a Western kind of quote unquote puppet, then he will not go for that kind of plan. But if, in the long run, if you could ensure that Ukraine remains a more or less the red line between NATO and Russia, then I think we will see a little bit more balance in the region. I mean, how many more countries should they have in NATO? I mean, if you look at the map, it's crazy.
That's right.
And there's no reason for NATO, right? The NATO was set up as an alliance against the Soviet Union. The famous containment policy of George Kennan, right?
They should have been disbanded.
Yeah,
That's right.
There's no need for NATO.
Yeah, no need for
But
NATO.
it's used as a kind of a weapon, a soft weapon, to contain now Russia, I suppose, and keep it at bay.
So Russia is rightfully, feel very concerned, right?
There's one problem though in Russia, I would say, though, finally. I mean, all this is the geopolitics of it. The one problem is, of course, Putin himself. I mean, the question is that he's not a very, some would say he's a very brutal, you use the word authoritarian. Some would say they're calling him Hitler and all that. Maybe it's exaggerated. But the fact of the matter is that he's no Democrat. He's got a lot of people, in his pocket. His oligarchs.
That's right.
He's very much in control of the economic, your economic, what you call it, players there within Russia, right?
But
to push the envelope a bit further, people say it's a somewhat corrupt regime.
But having said that, Prof, I think the last how many years they said the GDP and household income of the average Russian family has increased tremendously under Putin's. So
it could be. It's not a rich country by any stretch of the imagination. It's got a lot of resources.
Yeah.
But I think it needs to improve. From one point of view, it needs to improve.
So how do you see now the sanction will play out now, especially how it affects our economy, our regional economy, the ASEAN?
I think the immediate impact is inflation. I think we are already seeing gas prices going up in Malaysia. If we, our finance minister has mentioned, I think maybe last week, about the need to relook at the subsidy regime in Malaysia, because the government can no longer afford to subsidize oil. Right now, the RON 95 is set at RM2.05.
So it's going to go up.
And it will cost the country 28 billion at the moment to subsidize the oil, that cannot continue. That cannot go on, because I think we are not in the financial position. Malaysia is not in the financial position to continue with that sort of subsidies. And we look at the price of RON 97 is almost RM4 per liter. So these are the immediate ramifications of what is happening in Ukraine at the moment. I think the business community is very edgy. They are watching what is happening in Ukraine very closely, and they will decide not to continue with investments. Maybe in this region, or even in Europe, or even in China. We don't know, because the business community is very nervous.
Stock markets are taking a beating, right? Stock markets are taking a beating, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So that's the immediate impact. That's the immediate impact. Wars are
brace for impact.
Yes.
Brace for impact.
That's right. That's right. And I think Professor Johan is correctly said. Things are being played out. Minute by minute, and we don't know how far this war will escalate, and how long will continue, and what role will that NATO play in all of this, and will they continue to provide armaments to the Ukrainians, and how fierce the resistance will be from the Ukrainians themselves. If we look at history, the Finnish put up a strong fight against Russia during the Winter War. And of course, Finland is a country that can be used as an example for a successful bilateral relations with Russia. Finland is a liberal, socialist, democratic country. And as Professor Johan has rightly pointed out, they decided not to join NATO, but they are a member of EU, and they continue to trade with Russia. So they develop a trusting relationship with Russia. That is important. I think that is what is needed at the moment. Russia needs to be assured that their security will be protected, and I think things will fall back into place. But if the West continue to agitate the Ukrainians, then we'll have a prolonged war in our hands, and it will not benefit humanity at all.
Yeah. Okay, maybe to kind of end our discussion tonight, maybe we just look at how this Russia-Ukraine war is being reported in the media, because I can see there's a clear double standards have emerged in the Western medias, the way they report the war compared with other conflicts.
That's right.
And the mainstream narrative that I can see, that Putin is the villain, Ukraine is the victim, and US and the European allies are the good guy. What's your view on this?
That's the Western press. But I think there's you have an interesting. Have you watched Fox News lately? Fox, which is the American, the other side, they're taking quite critical view of because they're always there to attack Biden whenever because they are supporting Republicans. So that's that interesting thing, even within the US of A. But you're right. I mean, just turn on from BBC, supposed to be so independent. It's not. It's not so clear that they are so independent. For example, this thing about the maternity home, right? That's not true, apparently, right? There's a lot of fake things that are going around,
A lot. I think we have to be very careful with. Yeah,
you got to be careful what the media says, So you have to fact check on both sides, double fact check everything.
Double, triple fact check.
Double fact check, So I know there were some people acting out their roles, in Ukraine apparently.
Yes. A lot of
a lot of this sort of thing going on, But of course, I don't deny that people will suffer in a war, right?
Yeah.
After all, there are 2 million people who have left refugees. So I mean, to be fair, I mean, we are not the ones there. There's all this major sort of geopolitical thing that's going on, but ordinary people on the streets, ordinary folks are suffering. In any war, we've seen how bad it has. These wars have been for us in Southeast Asia. Vietnam War and so on. So
I think when we look at the news reporting in the Western media, I think we need to bear in mind that there is such a thing as white privilege.
Wow.
When we talk about the white privilege, they can always narrate things in accordance to the script that they want the public to believe. But I think in this era of social media, there's also a lot of disinformation and fake news going around, and I think one thing that actually stands out in this crisis is how easily the refugees from Ukraine were accepted by the West,
right?
As opposed to refugees from other parts of the world, the Syrians, the people fleeing war torn countries in the Middle East. I think that is the double standard that we need to point out to the rest of the world. But other than that, I think the Western media is I think is a lot more critical than the media we have in Malaysia. I think we have to give them that. We have to give them the credit for being able to give both sides of the story. But of course, with a heavy bias towards the West. And I think even then, as Professor Johan said, there are many media outlets. Depending on their ideology, they'll frame the story differently. Fox is, of course, a conservative media. They will frame the story differently from CNN. So you know, we need to watch both CNN and Fox to get the real picture. You know,
during the Trump time, I don't like Fox because they are very pro-Trump.
I know.
But
Absolutely,
now
you have to watch Fox
Yeah.
to get the true picture of the US situation.
And I also watch the RT TV, RT channel. They also bring kind of almost like independent kind of hope. So, but again, we have to be very careful, you know.
It is
So
Russian.
anyway, yeah,
It is Russian sponsored.
yeah. Okay.
And of course,
so,
CGTV is China.
yeah.
I like to watch Al Jazeera actually. It's
That's right.
and
Al
also,
Jazeera is best, the most balanced.
I watch Gravitas as well.
Gravitas.
They make a very good analysis as well, very detailed analysis. But again, sometimes it depends on who is the you know. So sometimes they are also biased towards certain parties. So, but again, I think in the era of digital world now, where we get a lot of different source of news and so on, I think we need to take in the information not at the face value. We have to go deep, fact checks and so on many times before we make our own conclusion. So I think we have come to the end of this session tonight. I think at least from our discussion tonight, we understand probably a bit more on the background of Russia-Ukraine conflict, the role of NATO, US and NATO, and especially how the sanction would have impact on the global economy and also on our own economy. So thank you very much, Prof. Johan, Professor Emeritus Johan, and Prof. Azeem, for sharing your insight. I think we have learned a lot tonight. So hopefully, let's pray that this war will end very soon, and let's see how it play out. Also in terms of the future of the global financial system. I think something good probably will come out of this, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. So with that, thank you once again, Prof. Johan and Prof. Azeem, and thank you for the audience for listening. I hope you have get some value from our session tonight. So, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good night.
Assalamualaikum. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Prof. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Yeah.